So I'm going to talk about the challenges, or some of the challenges. As Jim mentioned, he went through a long list of challenges of any 75-year projection, including those for long-term Social Security forecasting. I am going to focus on, in this 12 minutes or 11 minutes that I have remaining, talking about some challenges that we face in demographic projections. I'm going to tell you that demographic projections are important for Social Security forecasting. I think that's probably largely evident to most in the room, if not all. Nonetheless, I'm going to say it. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we grapple with our demographic forecasting in our demographic projections. That's not to say these other issues that Jim raised and that will also be discussed are not challenging, but rather this is just where I'm focusing our efforts, because it's been a particular area of interest for us over the past several years. So I will say a little bit about what our projections are. I will also say it's actually surprising to me how remarkably similar our projections are to other people in this space, including Social Security Administration, when you're looking at a 75-year forecast, because as with any long distance, any long traverse, whether it be over distance or time, you're a little bit off in the near term, and that just continues to compound. And so it's just mathematically very difficult to put together a long-term projection. We do consider these projections, not predictions. So the purpose of these projections is to establish a baseline off which we can measure changes. So if a policy change is proposed, how do we measure that change relative to what we think would occur in absence of the policy change? So just briefly, we at CBO project that the balance of the old age and survivors insurance trust fund will be exhausted in fiscal year 2033. The OASI and disability insurance trust funds, where they combined, that balance would be exhausted in fiscal year 2034. By a 75-year standard, those are not very long-term projections. That is very near-term. I think that Social Security was not really the emphasis of policymakers over the course of the past summer. I think that these dates and these exhaustion dates will likely make Social Security policy more salient for policymakers over the coming years than perhaps it has been over the past year or so. It's worth noting that in the first year after the balances of the trust funds are exhausted, that does not mean there's nothing left to pay benefits. That means that the resources available are not sufficient to pay benefits as scheduled under current law. And that shortfall is about 22% in that first year after exhaustion of the combined trust, of the trust funds where they combined in CBO's estimation, and that shortfall would increase over time. So that's a little bit about our projections. I want to talk about how research is informing our projections of Social Security's finances. And as I said just a few moments ago, demographics are a key factor in any projection of Social Security's finances. Demographics matter because how many people are in the economy matters. How many people are paying taxes, particularly payroll taxes, into the Social Security system matters. What people's earnings are matter. So not only their age, but their education composition and other relevant characteristics. So you have not only do number of people in the economy matter, the characteristics matter, and then so we've got a lot of demographic work that we do. And so we rely a lot on research from folks like you and others in the academic world and think tanks and elsewhere on how these relationships are changing over time. So I'm going to talk today about our projections of the fertility rate and thinking about how the fertility in the United States differs between native-born women and foreign-born women and how that relationship might be evolving over time. I'm also going to talk about immigration, and particularly the number and characteristics of other foreign nationals and how that is changing over time. Recent changes we've seen, thinking about recent and sort of two different measures. There were including as recently as this year. I will note when I talk about our demographic projections, when you see figures of our demographic projections, that is from a publication we released in January 2025, January of this year. Changes have occurred since then, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those changes and how those would likely affect projections going forward. Okay, so as I already teed up, we think hard about all aspects of demographic projections and all aspects of Social Security projections in general, but we in particular think very hard about fertility rates and the relationships between fertility in the United States and mother's country of origin. So when you have foreign nationals who have migrated to the United States have historically had higher fertility rates than native-born women, But we have a key question here in that fertility rates are declining globally. And so there's this key question about whether these past observed relationships between fertility and the mother's country of origin will hold true going forward. And so, for instance, we've got some research, and you'll note in this first citation from Carter, this research was published in 2000 and is based on a 1995 survey. So there's a lot of things that have changed about migrants and immigration since 1995. There's a lot of things that have changed about fertility, both in the United States and outside the United States since 1995. So these are the types of things that, you know, we're looking to the data where we can. We're looking to outside researchers. We're looking to those in think tanks and academic circles to help inform us on how these trends have changed over time. And up-to-date analyses and these sorts of things are critically important and relevant for what we do. We also take on board any information we can find, frankly. We look at all information, we assess, and you know, we try to triangulate and figure out what we can learn from the various pieces of information. I also said, teed up already, that I would be talking about changes in net immigration. I'm going to show you a couple figures in a moment, but net immigration has been a particularly uncertain area for assessing not only what has been occurring recently in the United States, because there's very limited data on individuals entering the United States, particularly illegally, and there's very, very little information on people leaving the United States sort of through any pathway. So net immigration projections are very uncertain. There are changes in law and policies that are occurring continually. And there's changing conditions in immigrants' country of origin. So there's this question in immigration: is it a push or is it a pull? Is it the characteristics of the United States that are bringing people to the United States, or is it the characteristics of the home country that are pushing people out of the home country, or likely some combination of the two? So in terms of how things have been changing and how quickly things can change, I'm going to talk a little bit about on this slide, and then I'm going to show you a couple pictures that show you, this really does matter. So as you can very well read, but nonetheless, from January to May 2024, so first half of last year, about 89,000 people per month were released after encountering a Customs and Border Patrol official between official ports of entry. That has changed significantly over time. There was a June 2024 executive order and then after that executive order, we saw some declines in the latter half of 2024. Those declines have continued in 2025. And as you can see here in this last bullet in the first segment, we have 800 people rather than 89,000 people per month. We're talking about 800 people per month in March, April, 1,000 in May, 800 people in June. So we're talking significant changes in this particular flow, even relative to a year ago. Similarly, when we've got people entering at official ports of entry discussed in the bottom segment. So for that group, the CHNV, or the Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans parole program is and the CBP1 app are particularly relevant. There was an executive order issued in January 2025 that ended both of those processes. Prior to that, we had about 45,000 appointments per month through the CBP1 app and about 25,000 people per month entering through the CHNV parole program. So this is just sort of highlights how difficult it can be to make a 75-year projection when there's so many changes that are occurring from one year to the next. So this graphic, again, this is from the January 2025 CBO report that we released. A lot has changed since then. You'll note here in this sentence here at the bottom, CBO expects to revise its projections of net immigration lower from what you're seeing here. But for later years, our most recent projection of net immigration is lower than SSA's, but higher than the Census Bureau's central estimate, the main series for the Census Bureau that's in the solid lines. But as you can see from even just looking at the Census Bureau estimates, what you think about immigration like there can be large swings in what you might think about immigration. Their low immigration, their main and their high immigration scenario are substantively different. And that does flow through to projections of the size of the population writ large. Sorry, I was just checking to make sure I'd said something properly. So anyway, so these do flow through. So this is the total population projections that are associated with those population net immigration projections on the previous slide. And as you can see, again, just looking at how these differences manifest over, just goes out 30 years. Over a 30-year period, basically you would extend these out for 75 years and it would be substantive. So this is CBO's projection, and this is one of the things, does immigration matter? We project that without immigration, the US population would shrink after 2033, which would be a very different economic structure or economic underpinning than we have experienced ever, possibly, but certainly since we've been keeping data. And so, again, I also told you that these changes in immigration and changes in the population, they matter for Social Security. Many immigrants start to pay payroll taxes or start to pay taxes in general, including payroll taxes into the Social Security program fairly immediately or fairly shortly after arrival. In terms of, from a Social Security perspective, in terms of eligibility for benefits, there are not only the quarters of coverage eligibility for disability insurance, or the time frames for disability insurance depending upon age, and the quarters of coverage for retirement insurance, retirement benefits. But also there's issues, not all immigrants are immediately or would be eligible for Social Security, and so there's some dependencies there. So you do see a lot of immigrants paying into the Social Security system through the payroll tax, by paying payroll taxes that then feed to Social Security, and then the eligibility for and eventual receipt of Social Security benefits is very different. It comes later in time and is not as prevalent. Great. Okay. -30 or 1 minute. So changes in immigration enforcement. So I'll zip through these very quickly. So there have been historical immigration enforcement efforts, such as the Secure Community Program. It's very different from the immigration enforcement that we're seeing discussed and potentially implemented today. And so how do we bridge the gap between what we've seen in history and what do we understand about what we've seen in history? What do we understand about what we see going forward? Here's some examples of research that we have relied on, which I'd be happy to talk with you about. And similarly, changes in interior enforcement, interior immigration enforcement can also change where people locate within the United States. So if we see people moving from higher enforcement areas to lower enforcement areas, that could have ramifications for the US economy as people are moving, like it could have ramifications for housing, construction, and similar issues. And here's some research examples.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. My name is Sophie Shin. I'm from Penn, Wharton budget model. Today we are talking about the challenges of long-term Social Security forecasting. Today I will introduce the Penn, Wharton budget model's approach and our analysis. So the Social Security analysis of Penn, Wharton budget model is built on our micro simulation. So we simulate the US population for the next 75 years, and transition probabilities are estimated based on historical patterns. So we construct this synthetic data set of US population with detailed demographic characteristics. And using this data, we can calculate Social Security taxes and benefits based on microsim individuals' earnings histories and family structures. And by aggregating these numbers, we can analyze the Social Security finances. So this is our baseline estimation. Cost and income expressed as percentages of taxable payroll and comparing with Social Security Administration's 2025 report. So you can see we have a higher cost rate in the long term. And as a result, we have higher summary deficit. We have minus 4.57% of payrolls compared to SSA, but we project the same depreciation year in 2034. So the main driver of this difference would be the old age dependency ratio. Is the population aged 65 and over relative to population aged 20 to 64. So we project higher and increasing old age dependency ratio compared to SSA's intermediate assumption. But in fact, census has even higher old age dependency ratio, which is also shown in CBO's report with a slower population growth. So in this next section, I'd like to walk you through several experiments we conducted using different micro simulation under alternative demographic and economic scenarios. So first one, we looked at the fertility rates. So under our baseline microsim, our long-term total fertility rate is around 1.7. So once we increase this number universally for all microsim women in the future, to target the Social Security's intermediate assumption of 1.9, now we have much lower cost rate. So these exercises actually narrows the gap in the final year deficit between SSA and PWBM about 60%, and in summary year gap about 50%. But we still have this remaining gap, and there will be other factors to contribute this gap, and one of these is real growth rate. So we have slightly lower real growth rates compared to SSA's intermediate assumption. And if we increase this number with the alternative micro simulation, now we have a lower cost rate, and these exercises narrow the final year gap about 20% and the summary gap about 40%. And I did another exercise with a different interest rate assumption. So we project slightly lower interest rates in the long term compared to SSA. And if we increase this number to align it with the SSA's intermediate assumption, there's actually no changes in annual rates because annual income only include revenue from payroll taxes and taxes on benefits, and annual cost only mostly include scheduled benefits. But this will change how we summarize annual deficits. So with higher interest rate, we have faster discounting of future. So we put relatively lower weights on greater future deficits. So now we have improvement in our summary balance with this higher interest rate. But it is important to note that we are currently looking at the Social Security program in isolation, and higher interest rate may have different implications on broader government budget. So, and I'll move on to the next experiments related to the different assumptions on immigration, which is relevant today. So if you look at the short-term changes in immigration, these exercises are purely illustrative because we do not have 2025 data yet. So we assume the 25% reduction in immigration inflow and 25% increase in immigration outflow over next 4 years. This will change the summary balance slightly, and then it will the trust fund combined trust fund depreciation is gonna be 2 quarters sooner. And once we look at the long-term changes in immigration, for example, 20% drop in immigration inflow over all future years. This will increase post rate in the long term. And the summary balance, we have greater deficit, and the trust fund depletion is going to be 3 months sooner. So these exercises demonstrate how different demographic and economic assumptions interact with the Social Security finances under a micro-sim framework. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jim, for organizing this session. This is based on a paper that we recently completed, and the bottom line is what we're doing is a simultaneous solution of key variables in the determination of the federal budget deficit and debt, and those are the real interest rate, the relative cost of healthcare, and economic growth. And like we've been discussing, the demographics are key here. And we're doing this in a long-term model with capital and labor. So I think people are aware of all these models that are both official and in the private sector. But just to remind people that the trustees report is the economic basis, the economic model that it is based on is a model of labor. There's no capital. The Medicare trustees report and the CMS projections of healthcare spending is an add-on. So it's based on the Social Security trustees report, and then healthcare is sort of an add-on. It's not simultaneous, which is important because healthcare is projected now is 20% of the economy, and it's projected to go up to 33% or even higher. The thing that we're most interested in, if you will, and we're ambitious here, is replacing the economic model is what's in the Treasury financial report of the U.S. government, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the whole government finances. But it's important. It is based on the trustees' report assumptions. And it is also based on current law. It is not based on current policy. We've heard a little bit about, obviously, about the Congressional Budget Office, and they have various models. That is a macro, and it is based on capital and labor, but healthcare is also an add-on, and we heard about the micro-sim model, and then now we're going to talk about us. So what we feel is unique to what we're doing is that it is two sectors of production with different productivity trends, healthcare and everything else, and so you have a domino effect. As two factors of production, capital and labor, and what comes out of it is the relative price of healthcare, and we're explaining why that is increasing. The real cost of capital, which leads to the interest rate in real terms, and that's important, obviously, for the government budget. There is this relationship, and we're totally stealing the CBO analysis here in terms of the relationship between the deficit and savings, basically the investment in the economy. And as I mentioned, demographics is key in these long-range models because it explains demand and supply, both for healthcare, for government benefits, but also in terms of what's going on in the growth of the economy. We are doing our model is a policy basis. It's not a current law basis. And I should mention also in terms of demographics that we're using the CBO demographics, not the trustees. I believe that the trustees have too high a fertility rate. Otherwise, we use a sort of a melange of parameters and forms based on the trustees report, CBO literature, data analysis. And any model, you're sort of, what are you doing it for? It depends on the focus and the instruments that policy you think are relevant. And, we make a judgment here. It's in these long-range models, model stability is an issue. You can get explosions, and it's a judgment, again, whether you think that explosion is real or it's just sort of based on a chain, unreasonable assumption. So there's a judgment here. I'm going to go through our equations, and I'm sorry for all the Greek, but I'll just sort of say that there are two factors, two production sectors. One is based on Cobb-Douglas, and G1 is the rate of productivity growth. And then the second is healthcare, and we model it as a Leontief production. Now this, you may say, is a little extreme, but it is based on the literature. That you do find that in the economy as a whole, the CES is a little less than 1. It's not quite 1. When you look at healthcare sector, and there's the literature on this, it's like 0.1. So it's not quite Leontief, but it's close enough. So we feel as if these are good assumptions in terms of functional form. And then in terms of the productivity and the economy, in the overall economy, again, we use the CBO assumption, but for healthcare, we're relying on, we basically use what CMS uses, which is much lower rate of productivity growth. Then some more equations. These are the first order conditions, basically from we'll call them the Baumol equations. Capital labor are measured by the BEA, and then of course that relates to demographics and the savings rate in the economy. So you have first order solutions both for wages and for the cost of capital. And I will say that when we solve our model, Jim will be interested to hear this, we come very close to a paper that Jim did like 25 years ago. It's not quite the same. It's not exactly the same, but it is. It was 0.85, 0.085, 8.5%, and we're a little higher, but it's in the ballpark. So I don't know. We found that somewhat reassuring. So there are also income identities in the model. So this equations 8 and 9 is really where you get this deficit savings effect interaction. And we do it, and we rely on the CBO analysis. It's a paper that was done in 2014, which I believe CBO still uses. It could be they've changed it since then. But anyways, we were persuaded by that. So there basically there is a sort of a semi-Barrow effect, but it's not a full Barrow effect. And we're just using the parameters in that paper for the first 40 years. And then we transitioned to a somewhat more optimistic, there was a higher impact on savings when there's deficits. And because that is model stability, because otherwise the model would explode. The government spends money directly on defense and non-defense goods, as well as Social Security, Medicare. We'll get to that in a minute. And then there's the factors of production. So capital has produced there's depreciation and investment. And investment, we have a very simple model based on historical relationship. So the government sector, so this is a model of the government budget deficit and debt. So it's the government spends money, which we've discussed directly. It collects money in taxes, but it also pays out benefits, and it pays money for interest spending. So this is pretty much the taxes is is based on historical relationships, both income and payroll taxes. It also gets some money from taxes on Social Security benefits and collects Medicare premiums. And then the benefits, of course, of Social Security, healthcare spending, which includes Medicare and Medicaid, veterans, et cetera, et cetera. The state pays some of Medicaid, so this is talking about federal spending. And then for the interest rate, we have the cost of capital, and we subtract out a risk premium, which is again based on the literature and data analysis. So there's a lot more going on in the model. Those are just the highlights. But in terms of the results, and we compare this to CMS, we compare it to a financial report of the U.S. government, and we compare it to the trustees' reports, depending on the variable. So the first variable, the first thing that we think is of importance is the ratio of healthcare spending to GDP. This is a relevant positive variable because of the low productivity in the sector. A lot of economists believe that there's a lot of low value in healthcare spending, so we think it's a relevant welfare policy variable. And so basically here, what we graph out three results. One is ours, which is the highest number. Then the lowest number is the CMS number based on current law, which it has a lot of price controls in essence. And both in the trustees report and I think widely that it's viewed as those are not realistic, certainly in the long run. I don't think they're even realistic in the short run because we just saw there was a bill, they gave it physicians, a 2.5, 3.5 increase. And I'm not criticizing that, it's just sort of, these price controls are very unrealistic. And in fact, the trustees reflect that because they produce an illustrative alternative where those price controls eventually are not effective. So it matters in terms of the results, and ours is our projection is higher, and it mainly because of both because of the demographics. We're using CBO demographics, so we have an older population, but also because we model the relative cost of healthcare simultaneously, whereas CMS sort of has basically an assumption that eventually the cost of healthcare relative cost of capital will decline. It's not really explained why, but that's just sort of what they assume. So the next variable is the ratio of federal debt held by the public to GDP. And we compare three, have our model, we have the financial report of the US government, and then we have CBO. CBO does that for the first 30 years. So ours is much higher, and we have higher interest payments, higher healthcare spending compared to the the financial report of the US government. And I would also just make this is a sort of a more technical point, but in the financial report of the US government, their Medicaid spending is not related to demographics, which is, I would say, is a mistake. But it matters because as the population ages, Medicaid, of course, pays for a lot of long-term care, and that they don't reflect that at all, and whereas we do. The real interest rate. So ours is higher than the trustees report and CBO. This is the real interest rate. It goes up. We start at 2.3%, which is basically the current real interest rate on tips is about 2%. We had 0.3% because the federal government does not usually, there's an inflation risk premium about 0.3%, so we have that. And then the model has it going up to about almost 3.5% because of, well, many reasons, but mainly because of the increase in the deficit and the relationship that we've described. It does go down, and that's mainly because of the decline in the growth rate in the economy. The trustees report just has it flat at 2.3, and then CBO has a lower number overall. Okay. And then the final ratio that we're looking at is the budget deficit. And then, well, I think that it sort of follows, the results follow from what I've discussed. And then the relative price of healthcare services, we have it slightly increasing, and this is mainly because this is an important result because there is this scarcity of labor, and because healthcare is produced in a reactive way, and given the low productivity, that actually leads to an increase in the relative cost of healthcare. And then in terms of a welfare measure, we measure it as per capita consumption less healthcare spending. And the result is that it declines pretty rapidly over this long period of time, which I think is important both in terms of the analysis and also the political stability of the system. So I won't be able to go through these results in detail, but basically what this does is the policy analysis. It looks at, first, let's focus on changes that we can make through policy or changes in assumptions. They're sort of related. focusing on the healthcare sector and what the impact is on the healthcare spending, deficit, debt, and our welfare measure. So that we call that a reform package. If we combine all of these changes, which are very significant and are very helpful in terms of getting sustainability in terms of the federal government's financial situation, but it's not enough. You need to also then add traditional financial fiscal policy instruments, tax increases, cutting spending, and making Social Security solid. So thank you.
I feel like seeing the debt and deficit projections you've just shown us. This is running an event study test of whether anyone who trades treasury bonds in the US is looking at this and seeing whether treasury yields have just increased as a result of seeing these projections. So, okay, so the last presentation is the SSA team. We're going to start with Sven, who is on Zoom, and then Polina is going to finish off.
Hello, and thank you for inviting us to present our work and some of the challenges that we face. Next slide, please. We will first talk about a little bit about what it is that we produce and why we do it, in particular, the legislative mandate for it, which is very important. And then I will mostly focus on those things, and then Polina will talk more about some aspects of how we do it. And again, that is largely determined by the what and the why. As we are both members of the economics team at the Office of the Chief Actuary, we will focus on the economics, but for the beginning, I will wear my actuarial hat here. Next slide, please. To talk about the legislative mandate for the trustees report and for the Office of the Chief Actuary, here are some direct quotes from the Social Security Act, and I won't read them. Just notice how many times the words actuary and actuarial are mentioned there. This is very clear that the law requires an actuarial valuation for the OASDI program. Next slide, please. So what does the actuarial valuation do? It needs to show the ability of the program's scheduled benefits or the program's scheduled revenue and trust fund reserves to meet the cost of the scheduled benefits. And it needs to measure the extent to which the scheduled revenue would fall short under current law, which then determines the size of the legislative changes that will be needed. Again, in terms of what needs to be in the report, it's important to think about who is the intended audience, or in the speech of the actuarial profession, who are the principles for which we do this work. And really, this is primarily there are two audiences. Congress has to rely on the report to assess the need of the program changes and to get the information on the effects of various legislative proposals. And ultimately, it is the public, because we are supposed to be the government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So the public really elects the Congress, and the public needs to be informed about the financial status of the program. Both the actuarial practice and the intended audience, who are not technical experts, call for the assumptions that are used in this valuation to be clear, transparent, reasonably simple, and stable. I'll emphasize this last part, stable, because it is important to maintain credibility in the report that the Congress and the public do not perceive changes in the valuation as being the whim of constantly changing assumptions, but a real change in the measures that are being observed. Next slide, please. One example of how stability is important and desirable. Stable assumptions tend to lead to stable results. Now, stable results would not necessarily be valuable in themselves if they ended up being inaccurate, but I think this is an example where we've done a pretty good job. In the last 14 reports, the projected year of depletion of the reserves of the trust funds is within a two-year range. And as we approach that date, I think we are more and more confident about that range. Even before that, it was a fairly narrow range of the year of depletion that was projected. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the model obviously is to help with the long-range actuarial projections that are in the trustees report, and those projections are then used as the baseline, and the model is also used to evaluate the effects of legislative proposals for changes in the OSDI program. We generally assume that the OSDI program remains as set by current law, and this specifically is about the program, so we don't have to worry about various other things like what happens if the budget deficits explode and so on. Or if we are evaluating proposals, we assume that the specified changes to the program that are specific to that legislative proposal. It's important that the purpose of actuarial valuation is not a forecasting model, and projections are made given a set of demographic, economic, and program-specific assumptions. So these assumptions are transparent, and anybody who wants to check what would be the effect of different assumptions can use different assumptions and see what it would be. We will focus, as I said, on the economic assumptions, but let me just give you an example of how difficult it is to forecast the future in the demographic area. In the late 1930s, Swedish total fertility rate dropped below 1.7. And in 1941, Alma and Gunnar Myrdal, who I think can be considered Norse gods of social science, published their projections of Swedish population, which basically said that it was at its peak and that it would decline. And they had four scenarios that projected the population. So at the time, the population was a little over 6 million. They projected the population for mid-1980s to be between 4 and 6 million. It was 8.5 million, and today it's almost 11 million. So its projections are difficult, especially about the future, as Yogi Berra said. Now, there are many macroeconomics models that have different purposes, and they certainly can help set the assumptions. They can inform the actuarial model in many ways, and we definitely consider them very useful. Next slide, please. And just as an example of what we mean by, we don't assume, we don't consider these projections to be a realistic forecast of the future, and they're not even a realistic scenario beyond the trust fund depletion, because the projections really have to measure the gap between the cost and the income, which is not part of the current law does not allow the trust funds to pay those scheduled benefits, as we have already seen in some of the other presentations. But it is important to have that baseline to be able to evaluate legislative proposals. So having said that, I will hand over to Polina to talk about some aspects of the model.
All right, thank you, Sven. Thank you, everybody, for having me here. I want to go through some of the highlights of the economic model that is within the general actuarial model. I'm severely pressed for time, so I'm going to go faster for some of these things. Now, into the economic model, the inputs that we get are historical data, the economic assumptions, both things like productivity growth and interest rates and such. And also the entire set of demographic projections that our demography group does for us before we ever get to economics. And the ultimate result we want to get out of the economic model is are the taxable earnings, because that's what determines the revenue to the trust fund, and covered employment that's relevant for determining benefits. This right here is an illustration. This is by far not every detail of the model, but an illustration of how we move from aggregates to the taxable wages that we want to get in the end, was highlights of some of the things that are challenging along the way. So the way we get GDP, Mark correctly said, we mostly have labor in this economy, in this model. So we have the entire set of population projections, then we have assumptions about productivity growth, average hours growth, unemployment rate, and the like, from which we can get a labor force, and then we get GDP. Now we narrow this down on the way to taxable wages. The first step is to get to the total labor compensation. This is where the labor share of output becomes important. Labor share of output ultimately in the long term is a projection, and then in the short term, sort of we converge to the ultimate assumption. Now, once you get to total labor compensation, we need to get to wages. Well, also self-employment income, which I'm going to ignore for this purposes right now. Because some parts of the total compensation is not wages. This is things like employee contributions to social insurance and also, as Mark alluded to, employee contributions to the employer-sponsored health insurance. And this is where thinking about future growth and healthcare costs comes in to be important. Now, so once you remove those, you end up with aggregate earnings. And then we need to do two steps that I think are specific to us. First, we need to exclude non-covered wages. Not all wages in the economy covered by Social Security. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And then once you got to covered wages, because Social Security taxes apply up to the taxable maximum every year, this is where the distribution of earnings becomes important, because interplay between distribution of earnings and the tax max, as we call it every year, determines your taxable ratio, how much of the covered wages will be taxable. And that determines the revenue to the trust fund. So this was a super short illustration, and I'm totally out of time, but I'm going to ask Levi for a couple minutes. All right, so this slide I'm going to mostly skip because this talks about various challenges that most macroeconomic models have, and the panel before me amply illustrated this. So demography is important, healthcare growth is important, productivity is important. Moving on to things that are a little more specific for us, because for our model, standard measures of employment and earnings is just the starting point. We need to get to specifically define taxable earnings and covered employment. Earnings distribution is important for the reason I just said. It interplays with tax max, get your taxable ratio. Also, we need to worry about sectoral composition of employment and earnings, because in some sectors, employees are not covered by Social Security. Biggest example for US for that is that many employees in state and local government sectors are not covered by Social Security. They don't pay taxes, they don't get benefits. We also need to worry about immigration, and Mala did much better exposition than I'm gonna, so I'm not gonna talk about detail, but also there are some immigrants who say authorized to work but not covered by Social Security, for example, students and exchange visitors. So we have to keep track of that. And I want to spend a little more time on the last point. We have to worry about a specific measure of employment, not just like the average weekly employment. This is what all economists call employment. I'm an economist. That's what I thought employment was. But we also have this other measure of employment we call total at any time employment. This is a number of people in a given year who had job at any point in the year. That is important for determining people's eligibility for benefits. Projecting this thing is not easy, unfortunately. And we got a great illustration of just how complicated this is in the year 2020, when COVID just did a number on employment, on shifts of employment throughout the year, and figuring out the total anytime employment was quite a thing. I was going to talk about this, but I'm going to skip this, just say for a minute. This is an illustration of two of those things, labor share and taxable ratio, to show that they changed over time. and it actually mattered for the financial social security. Now, given that I probably convinced you that there is a lot of uncertainty about these challenging things we need to project, what do we do about that? In the trustees report, we address uncertainty in 3 ways. Of those of you who've seen a trustees report, you know there are 3 alternative sets of assumptions. Intermediate, that's what we mostly talk about, but there's also low cost and high cost, where the assumptions are all varied in the direction of making cost to the program lower or making them higher. We also, independently from the 3 alternatives, have a stochastic simulation, also presented in the trustees report, where we allow the key assumptions variables to vary stochastically throughout the period, and it gives you a distribution of possible outcomes for the program. Finally, we also present sensitivity analysis, where for the key things that people are most interested in, we vary 1 assumption at a time, like fertility rate, for example, and then compute throughout the entire model to see what happens to the actuarial balance as a result. Seeing how I'm totally out of time, I'm not going to talk about how all this is the 3 alternatives, what they look like, and overlay stochastic simulation on top of that. And I'm just going to leave this on the screen, since if you want more information, we have tons more on our website, the entire trustees report this year, all the prior years, various studies, stochastic study, and everything else. So I'm going to stop here and we can go to questions, I suppose.
So let me thank all 4 of our presenters. And I know there's an enormous amount that we've just covered, and we're not going to really be able to dive in and do lots of Q&A. And I will ask, actually, since we're going to adjourn to lunch very soon, that maybe the 4 presenters can split up during lunch. And that way, if there are conversations about, doing more of this, people can talk with you at lunch and try to, detect aspects of this. Just one thing two things I would just observe from what we've just heard, right? One is the challenges around immigration are huge, although exactly how you perform the empirical analysis, which is using the past evidence to figure out what we might be going to in the future, is a really tough question. And anyone who comes up with a great inspiration about how to econometrically and just sort of conceptually to do that, I think there's huge demand. The second, one of the things that was built into Mark's model that as he zipped through, we didn't spend a lot of time in, is these kind of feedback models of as the deficit grows, what happens to interest rates, what happens to policies and things like that. And those of you who may have seen, there's a Brookings paper by Alan Auerbach and Danny Yagan, which looks at for the full fiscal deficit in the US, what is the policy response rule? As deficits get larger, does it appear that we have fiscal contraction, or how does that work? And that seems to have shifted over time in the US. And if you move from an environment where larger deficits lead to fiscal contraction to one where larger deficits seem to lead to somewhat larger deficits still, that's a very big thing when you're running a 90-year long-term simulation. So those are issues where we have not spent a lot of time, but there probably is more need for that. So I'm going to ask, is there any really burning question that someone, and Olivia looks like she has one, so I'm going to go to Olivia and then maybe to Steve, and then we're going to adjourn. So,
I'll let
great.
you judge the degree of burning. But so I was really interested in, maybe from all 4 of you, if you can, talk about how you are planning to model the impact of AI on productivity, employment, earnings, retirement behavior, maybe even immigration. So that's
a long question. I'm going to let Steve ask his question. We're going to go to the authors quickly to respond to both questions.
Thanks. So thank you guys all. This was great and very informative. I've been working with John Giannakopoulos at Yale to build a model similar to some of the models that you guys have. And one of the things that has been challenging for us is that there doesn't seem to be enough information in the public domain about any of these models. I mean, there's a broad description, but there's not actually like a replication code or specific equations out there. And I'm just wondering if in the spirit of transparency, if there's any way that a replication package or some other really specific details of the equations could be made available.
So I think given the time, we're going to start. Molly, you're going to be the first one if you'd like to respond to these questions. We're just going to work right through Molly, Sophie, Mark, and Polina, and Sven. We're going to leave you out of the mix since you're not in the room for the moment. So
I'll just be I'll be very quick and try to address both. On the question of AI, we are continuing to watch, we are continuing to monitor, we are continuing to learn more, and we will continue to do so. And so as others learn more, please make sure that you're writing about it and telling us about it, and we can incorporate that. That is not only in my group, in the macroeconomic analysis division group, like the whole agency. And then on your question about increased transparency and code posting and these types of things, there's a constant balance. We obviously our first clients are serving the Congress, and they have many, many questions for us. And then we also work very hard to improve transparency and continue to refine how we are being transparent. We have posted some code, not on these models particularly. And so we have some code, I think, for our cap tax model, for instance. And so this is something we are endeavoring to do more of. There are resource constraints. And so we try to write as much as we can and being transparent. We try to do as much as we can, and we never have as much time as we want. Sorry.
Yeah, we are also evaluating future changes in our model, and we have some documentation on microsim and how we estimate different probabilities on our website. And we are also try to open more code resources to public. Thank you.
To Olivia's question, I think the AI would in our model would definitely come in through productivity, both in terms of the general economy, but actually specifically with regard to healthcare. There is some research, I think Brookings has done this, sort of looking at is AI really going to have a positive impact on productivity in the healthcare sector. There's just some promise there, but it hasn't happened. So that's where I think the focus would be. The paper is pretty detailed, so hopefully you could find something useful.
So to Olivia's question, the way we would think about AI is, well, long-term growth rate and labor productivity for us is an assumption. And so, but it doesn't mean we just pick a number. There was extensive discussion going into this, and a lot of personnel, I did a lot of literature review to inform what the thinking is out there on the various things that could affect the productivity, AI being one of them. This is total segue in the next question. Now, all our assumptions on the website, there is much more information. Like we have all the assumptions, not only economic, but like demographic assumptions. It's an assumption memo that discusses the detail of what they are and what the thinking that went into them. There's also model documentation that's a little more technical that there's also available. Code, yeah, we don't post, and this might be something to discuss later and not with me.
Great. Okay, thank you. And by the way, one of the issues that came up at the very end, right, is how do we describe uncertainty in these sorts of things? That may even be a topic for us to tackle in a future year, which is how do you do stochastic simulations? How do you think about the covariance between the different shocks that might play out? And I mean, AI is a perfect example of that, whereas it would potentially affect capital markets, labor markets, and you could have productivity effects. You could also have a big shock to labor market activity, and all fits together. So
for the stochastic, we have recently updated our stochastic studies, actuarial study. It's very detailed about how we do the stochastic stuff, so you can find it simple, same place on the website.
yeah,